The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, when the Stockholm fog had settled over the city like a grey shroud and the first hints of winter's approach could be felt in the bone-deep chill that seeped through even the thickest windows of the KTH Royal Institute of Technology. Dr. Eric Hellstrom had been examining spore samples from a particularly virulent strain of Mycelium when his assistant, young Gunnar Svensson, knocked hesitantly upon his laboratory door. "Professor," the boy stammered, his usually steady voice betraying an unusual nervousness, "there's been a message from the Transit Authority. They're requesting your immediate consultation on what they term an unprecedented biological phenomenon in the underground system." Eric barely glanced up from his microscope, where the familiar branching patterns of fungal hyphae spread across his field of vision like the delicate tracework of some cosmic spider's web. At 53, he had grown accustomed to such dramatic pronouncements from various municipal departments, most of which proved to be nothing more than common mold infestations blown out of proportion by bureaucratic anxiety. "Gunnar, you know as well as I that the Stockholm tunnels are a veritable garden of fungal diversity. Every autumn brings new complaints from the maintenance crews about slime molds and various saprotrophic. File it with the others and—" "Sir," the young man interrupted with unprecedented boldness, "they specifically mentioned Kimling Station." The name struck Eric with an almost physical force. Kimling, the ghost station, as it was known among the transit workers and urban explorers who whispered of its existence in hushed tones. Officially abandoned since the 1970s when budget constraints halted its construction, the station existed in a peculiar bureaucratic limbo, neither sealed nor accessible, neither forgotten nor maintained. Eric had heard rumors of its strange acoustics, of maintenance workers who refused to venture into its depths alone, of equipment that malfunctioned in ways that defied rational explanation. Setting aside his microscope with suddenly trembling hands, Eric accepted the telegram with a gravity that surprised even himself. The message was brief but laden with an urgency that seemed to seep through the very paper: bioluminescent growth exhibiting unusual properties. Standard containment protocols ineffective. Request immediate mycological assessment. Temporal phenomena reported. Exercise extreme caution. The phrase, temporal phenomena, lingered in Eric's mind like a half-remembered nightmare. In his 30 years of studying the secret kingdoms of fungi, he had encountered organisms that challenged conventional understanding, species that seemed to exist at the very boundaries of known biology. Yet never had he received an official communication that dared to suggest something so fundamentally impossible as temporal distortion. Within hours, Eric found himself descending into the bowels of Stockholm's underground system, guided by a nervous transit supervisor named Lars Magnusson whose hands shook as he operated the service elevator. The man spoke in clipped, anxious sentences about the discovery, how a routine inspection of abandoned tunnels had revealed patches of growth that glowed with their own inner light, how the standard industrial bleach treatments had not merely failed but seemed to accelerate the organism's spread. "It's not natural, Professor," Magnusson whispered as they descended past the familiar stalks of the blue line into depths that few living souls had witnessed. "The boys who found it, they've been different since. Quiet. Like they've seen something that changed them." The elevator shuddered to a halt at a depth that Eric's instruments registered as impossible, nearly twice as far below ground as any official schematic indicated. The doors opened with a pneumatic sigh that seemed to exhale decades of stagnant air, thick with the musty sweetness of decay and something else, something that made Eric's trained nostrils twitch with unease. Kimling Station stretched before them like the ribcage of some immense fossilized beast, its concrete arches disappearing into darkness that their industrial lighting could not fully penetrate. But it was not the architectural grandeur of the abandoned platform that seized Eric's attention, it was the soft, pulsing glow that emanated from the walls themselves. The bioluminescent growth covered nearly every surface in sight, forming intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow even as Eric watched. Unlike any fungal colony he had encountered, this organism exhibited a rhythmic quality to its luminescence, a steady pulse that reminded him disturbingly of a massive, slow heartbeat. The light itself was rawn, not the familiar blue-green of typical bioluminescent organisms, but a sickly amber that seemed to contain depths and dimensions that hurt to contemplate directly. My God, Eric breathed, approaching the nearest patch with the reverence of a scholar confronting a living manuscript from some antediluvian library. He withdrew his sampling kit with hands that trembled with excitement rather than fear, though a small voice in the depths of his mind whispered warnings he chose to ignore. The moment his sterile spatula touched the glowing surface, the entire colony responded. The pulse quickened, the amber light deepening to a rich golden hue that painted the tunnel walls with shifting shadows. More disturbing still was the sound, a barely audible susurrus that seemed to emanate not from the growth itself but from the very air around it, as if the organism were somehow modulating the acoustic properties of its environment. Eric carefully transferred samples into his collection vials, noting with growing bewilderment that the material seemed to resist conventional containment. The growth exhibited a viscosity that defied classification, neither truly liquid nor solid, and possessed a temperature that registered several degrees above the surrounding air despite the absence of any obvious metabolic heat source. Professor, Magnusson called from behind him, his voice strained with an emotion Eric could not immediately identify. How long have we been down here? Eric glanced at his watch and felt the first cold fingers of genuine fear trace along his spine. According to the timepiece, a reliable Swiss chronometer he had owned for 20 years, they had been in the tunnel for nearly 4 hours. Yet it seemed mere minutes since they had descended from the surface, and the conversation with Magnusson felt as fresh in his memory as if it had occurred moments before. That's impossible, Eric muttered, checking the watch again and finding the reading unchanged. We've been here no more than 30 minutes. But even as he spoke the words, he became aware of other inconsistencies that his absorbed attention had previously overlooked. His sample collection case, which had been pristine when he opened it, now showed signs of age and that suggested months of use. The metal surfaces bore a patina of oxidation that should have required extensive exposure to moisture and time to develop. More unsettling still was the growth itself, which had visibly expanded during their brief observation. Where Eric had taken his initial samples, new tendrils of the luminescent organism had already begun to fill the gaps, pulsing with increased vigor as if his intrusion had somehow nourished rather than damaged it. The laboratory analysis that followed over the next several days, or what Eric believed to be days, though his temporal perception had become increasingly unreliable, revealed impossibilities that challenged the very foundations of his scientific understanding. Under the electron microscope, the organism's cellular structure defied every principle of terrestrial biology. The cell walls, if they could be called such, seemed to exist in a state of constant flux, their boundaries shifting and reforming in patterns that suggested geometric dimensions beyond the familiar three of normal space. Most disturbing of all was the organism's apparent response to observation itself. When Eric examined samples under standard magnification, they exhibited relatively conventional fungal characteristics. But as he increased the resolution, peering deeper into the organism's structure, it seemed to peer back. The cellular arrangements would reorganize themselves into configurations that resembled neural networks, complete with what appeared to be synaptic connections firing in complex patterns. Sleep became elusive as Eric found himself consumed by the implications of his discovery. In his dreams, when dreams came at all, he found himself wandering through vast underground chambers where the walls pulsed with golden light and whispered in languages that predated human speech. He would wake with fragments of alien words on his tongue and the unshakable conviction that something vast and patient was taking notice of his investigations. The samples themselves exhibited behavior that violated every principle of mycological science. Rather than degrading over time, they seemed to grow stronger and more active with each passing day. Worse, they appeared to be communicating with each other across the laboratory, their bioluminescent pulses synchronizing despite being housed in separate, sealed containers. Eric began to document patterns in the pulsing, applying the same analytical techniques he might use to decipher the breeding cycles of conventional fungi. What he discovered sent tremors of unease through his increasingly sleepless nights. The patterns were not random but followed mathematical sequences of staggering complexity, equations that seemed to describe curves and dimensions that existed beyond normal geometry. It was during his third consecutive night in the laboratory, hunched over spectral analysis charts that revealed impossible emission frequencies, that Eric first heard them clearly, the the whispers that seemed to emanate not from the samples themselves but from the very air around them. They spoke in sibilant tones that bypassed his conscious mind and lodged themselves directly in the primitive regions of his brain where ancestral fears dwelt. The language, if it could be called such, possessed no resemblance to any human tongue, yet Eric found himself beginning to understand fragments of meaning that filtered through like half-remembered dreams. The whispers spoke of depth and time, of patience measured in geological epochs, of a vast network that stretched beneath the earth like the nervous system of some immense organism. Most terrifying of all was the growing certainty that the whispers were not merely random acoustic phenomena but directed communications, that something within the luminescent growth was attempting to establish contact with him specifically. The organism had learned his patterns, had observed his methodical approach to scientific investigation, and was now responding in kind. As the days blurred into nights and his isolation in the laboratory deepened, Eric began to perceive connections that his rational mind insisted could not exist. The growth patterns in his samples seemed to mirror the architectural layout of Stockholm itself, as if the organism possessed an intimate knowledge of the city's underground structure. More disturbing still were the sections that corresponded to areas of the city he had never explored, tunnels and chambers that existed on no official schematic yet which the organism mapped with disturbing precision. His colleagues began to express concern for his welfare, noting his increasingly haggard appearance and the obsessive intensity with which he pursued his research. Dr. Anders Blomqvist from the Department of Geology attempted to engage him in conversation about his findings, but Eric found himself reluctant to share the full extent of what he had discovered. How could he explain that he was in communication with an organism that appeared to exist partially outside the normal flow of time? How could he describe the growing conviction that his samples were not isolated specimens but remote sensory organs of something vast and alien that dwelt in the depths beneath Stockholm? The breaking point came when Eric realized that his memory of the initial expedition to Kimling Station no longer matched his written notes. According to his journal, he had spent 6 hours in the tunnel and had collected samples from 17 different locations. Yet his clear recollection was of a brief 30-minute visit during which he had gathered material from only 3 sites. More disturbing still, his sample collection now contained vials he had no memory of filling, each labeled in his own handwriting with coordinates that corresponded to areas of the Stockholm underground he had never visited. The samples themselves were more active than ever, their golden luminescence now bright enough to read by in complete darkness. That night, as autumn gave way to the harsh reality of Swedish winter and the city above settled into its familiar rhythm of early darkness and artificial light, Eric made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his existence. He would return to the underground, not as a detached scientific observer but as a willing participant in whatever communication the organism was attempting to establish. The whispers had grown stronger, more insistent, and with them came visions of vast networks spreading through darkness, of chambers filled with golden light where time moved according to laws that human consciousness could barely comprehend. The organism was offering him knowledge, not the limited understanding that came from external observation, but the profound awareness that could only be achieved through direct contact. As he prepared his equipment for another descent into the depths beneath Stockholm, Eric felt the last vestiges of his purely human perspective beginning to dissolve. Whatever dwelt in the luminescent darkness had been patient, allowing him to approach at his own pace, but now it was time for a deeper understanding. The network that pulsed beneath the city was ready to reveal its true nature, and Eric Hellström, distinguished professor of mycology, respected member of the scientific community, an increasingly isolated seeker of forbidden knowledge, was ready to receive its revelations. The implications of what he had discovered thus far were staggering enough to shatter the foundations of human understanding, yet Eric suspected that he had glimpsed only the most superficial layer of a reality that extended into dimensions his mind could not yet encompass. The organism beneath Stockholm was not merely a fungus, it was something far older, far more complex, and far more intelligent than anything terrestrial biology could account for. As he descended once again into the depths of Kimling Station, Eric carried with him the growing certainty that he was about to cross a threshold from which there could be no return. The whispers had grown clearer during his absence, and with them had come dreams of networks that spanned not just the breadth of the city but depths that extended far beyond the reach of human exploration. Something vast and patient had been waiting in the darkness beneath Stockholm, and the doctor was about to discover exactly what it wanted from him. The second descent into Kimling Station occurred during the darkest hours of a November night when Stockholm lay shrouded beneath a blanket of early snow that muffled the city's usual urban symphony into an oppressive silence. Eric had waited until the transit system had ceased its daily operations, using his newfound influence with the increasingly nervous Lars Magnusson to gain access to service corridors that had been officially sealed since his previous visit. The changes were immediately apparent. Where once the bioluminescent growth had been confined to patches along the tunnel walls, it now formed an intricate web of connections that spanned the entire abandoned platform. The organism had grown with impossible speed, its golden tendrils threading through cracks in the concrete and spreading across surfaces in patterns that hurt to follow with the naked eye. The geometric arrangement seemed to shift and flow when observed directly, creating optical illusions that left Eric's vision swimming with afterimages of impossible angles. More disturbing than the organism's expansion was its apparent anticipation of his arrival. As Eric stepped from the service elevator onto the platform, the entire network pulsed in unison, its luminescence brightening to an intensity that rendered his electric torch unnecessary. The rhythmic pulsing had evolved from the simple heartbeat-like cadence he had observed during his first visit into something far more complex, a symphony of light that seemed to convey layers of meaning his human consciousness could barely grasp. The whispers had grown stronger as well, no longer requiring the deep silence of his laboratory to be perceived. They emanated from every surface touched by the growth, creating an acoustic environment that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Eric found that by adjusting his position within the tunnel, he could isolate different voices from the chorus, each speaking in the same alien tongue yet conveying distinct nuances of meaning. Armed with portable spectrographic equipment and a modified recording apparatus of his own design, Eric began the systematic documentation of what he was increasingly convinced was not merely a biological phenomenon but a form of communication of unprecedented sophistication. The electromagnetic signatures he detected defied conventional understanding, operating on frequencies that should have been impossible for any terrestrial organism to generate. Yet it was the spatial properties of the growth that provided the most profound revelation. Using ground-penetrating radar units borrowed from his colleague Dr. Magnus Andersson in the geology department, Eric discovered that the luminescent network extended far beyond the confines of Kimling Station. The tendrils stretched through the bedrock itself, following pathways that connected disparate locations across Stockholm's underground infrastructure with impossible precision. The radar images revealed a vast three-dimensional web that spanned the entire city, with major nodes located beneath significant architectural landmarks. The Royal Palace, Stockholm Cathedral, the City Hall, each appeared to be anchored by massive concentrations of the organism that extended deep into the Earth's crust. Most unsettling of all was the discovery that the network structure bore an uncanny resemblance to neural pathways, complete with what appeared to be synaptic junctions at regular intervals. Dr. Andersson himself had become increasingly intrigued by Eric's research, particularly after examining rock samples from construction sites across the city that revealed microscopic traces of the same impossible cellular structures. A man of traditionally skeptical temperament, Magnus had initially dismissed Eric's more extraordinary claims as the product of laboratory fatigue and academic obsession. Yet the geological evidence was undeniable. Something had been growing through Stockholm's bedrock for far longer than conventional timelines would suggest. The isotopic dating makes no sense, Magnus confided during one of their increasingly frequent consultations in Eric's laboratory. According to every test I've run, these cellular structures have been present in our bedrock samples for millennia. Some specimens suggest continuous growth spanning geological epochs that predate the last ice age. The implications of this discovery sent tremors through Eric's already strained psyche. If the organism had indeed been present beneath Stockholm for thousands of years, then its current period of accelerated growth and communication represented not an emergence but an awakening. Something that had lain dormant in the Earth's depths was stirring to consciousness, and Eric's investigations had somehow served as the catalyst for its revival. This theory gained disturbing support when Dr. Nils Bergman from the Department of Neurology approached Eric with observations that defied medical explanation. Nils, a longtime colleague whose research focused on collective behavioral patterns in urban populations, had noticed anomalous trends in Stockholm's psychological profile that correlated with unusual precision to Eric's mapping of the underground network. The statistical correlations are impossible to ignore, Nils explained during a clandestine meeting in Eric's laboratory, his normally steady voice betraying an undercurrent of deep unease. Hospital admissions for sleep disorders, reports of collective dreaming, even fluctuations in the city's crime statistics, they all correspond to your network density maps with mathematical precision. The data Nils presented was staggering in its implications. Areas of the city directly above major network nodes showed dramatically reduced rates of violent crime, while residents reported unusually vivid dreams featuring underground chambers and golden light. More disturbing still were the accounts of collective experiences, entire apartment buildings whose residents had shared identical nightmares of vast spaces beneath the earth where something immense and patient waited in the darkness. It's as if the city's entire population is being influenced by some form of subsonic or electromagnetic field, Nils continued, his academic composure cracking as he described phenomena that challenged his understanding of human neurology. The EEG patterns we're seeing in affected individuals show synchronization across large populations, something that should be neurologically impossible without direct physical connection. Eric listened to these revelations with a mixture of vindication and growing dread. His suspicions about the organism's intelligence were being confirmed by evidence from disciplines far removed from mycology, yet each new piece of data painted a picture of something so alien and vast that his human mind struggled to encompass its full significance. The breakthrough came during his fourth nocturnal expedition to Kimling Station, when Eric made the fateful decision to establish direct physical contact with the network. The whispers had grown so insistent that they now followed him even to the surface, creating a constant background murmur that made normal human interaction increasingly difficult. Sleep had become impossible without pharmaceutical assistance, and his dreams were filled with visions of golden corridors that stretched beyond the boundaries of earthly architecture. Approaching the largest concentration of growth, a massive node that covered nearly the entire eastern wall of the platform, Eric removed his protective gloves and pressed his bare palm against the luminescent surface. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The entire network blazed with light so intense that it seared afterimages across his retinas, while the whispers exploded into a cacophony of alien voices that bypassed his ears entirely and resonated directly within his skull. But beneath the sensory assault, Eric perceived something far more profound, a vast intelligence awakening to his presence. The organism was not merely responding to his touch but actively scanning his consciousness, reading the neural patterns of his thoughts with the casual efficiency of a scholar perusing a familiar text. In that moment of contact, Eric understood that he was not the observer but the observed, not the scientist but the specimen. The visions that followed transcended anything his previous experiences had prepared him for. He found himself perceiving Stockholm not as a city of stone and steel but as a living organism whose circulatory system was the network of tunnels and passages that honeycombed the earth beneath. The familiar landmarks of his daily existence revealed themselves as mere surface manifestations of something far more complex, a symbiotic relationship between human consciousness and an intelligence so ancient that it had witnessed the birth and death of countless civilizations. Through the network's perception, Eric saw the true history of Stockholm's development. The city's expansion had not been guided solely by human planning but subtly influenced by the organism's growth patterns. Streets curved to follow the network's major arteries, while significant buildings had been positioned to serve as anchor points for the vast underground web. The metro system itself had been unconsciously designed to complement rather than interfere with the organism's existing infrastructure. Most terrifying of all was the revelation that Stockholm was not unique. Through the network's vast memory, Eric glimpsed similar configurations beneath dozens of major cities across the globe: London, Paris, New York, Tokyo, each harboring its own variation of the same fundamental pattern. Humanity had unknowingly constructed its greatest urban centers as components in a planetary nervous system whose true purpose remained hidden from conscious awareness. The contact lasted for what felt like hours but registered on Eric's instruments as mere minutes, another temporal distortion that was becoming increasingly common in his interactions with the organism. When the connection finally severed, leaving him gasping and disoriented on the tunnel floor, Eric found that his understanding of reality had been fundamentally altered. The whispers were no longer alien and incomprehensible but carried meaning that filtered directly into his consciousness without the need for translation. The organism, or rather, the vast collective intelligence of which it was merely a single component, was attempting to communicate concepts for which human language possessed no adequate vocabulary. It spoke of time measured in geological epochs, of consciousness distributed across planetary distances, of purposes that transcended the brief flicker of individual human existence. Over the following days, as Eric struggled to process the implications of his contact with the network, he became aware of subtle changes in his own physiology. His vision had become more acute, particularly in low-light conditions, while his hearing had developed sensitivities to frequencies that had previously been beyond human perception. More disturbing still were the moments when he found himself thinking thoughts that seemed to originate from outside his own consciousness, fragments of alien logic that intruded upon his mental processes like whispered suggestions from an unseen advisor. The network was claiming him, gradually integrating his nervous system into its vast web of connections. The process was subtle but inexorable, each contact accelerating his transformation from passive observer to active participant in something whose scope exceeded human comprehension. Eric realized with growing horror that his investigation had been orchestrated from the beginning, that the organism had been guiding his research, feeding him revelations at precisely the pace required to ensure his willing cooperation. Yet even as this understanding dawned upon him, Eric found himself unable to resist the network's influence. The knowledge it offered was intoxicating, promising insights into the fundamental nature of consciousness and reality that no human had ever achieved. The price, his gradual absorption into an alien collective, seemed almost insignificant compared to the cosmic awareness that beckoned from the depths beneath Stockholm. As winter deepened and the city above settled into its familiar rhythm of artificial light and heated buildings, Eric made preparations for his final descent into the network's embrace. His colleagues had begun to notice his increasingly erratic behavior, while his physical appearance showed signs of the profound changes occurring within his cellular structure. Golden filaments had begun to appear beneath his skin, following the pathways of his circulatory system like luminous veins that pulsed in rhythm with the network's distant heartbeat. The transformation was accelerating, and Eric knew that soon he would face a choice that would determine not only his own fate but potentially the future of human consciousness itself. The network had shown him visions of what awaited, a form of existence that transcended individual identity while preserving the essential patterns of awareness that defined sentient life. It was offering humanity a form of immortality, but at the cost of everything that had previously defined human nature. In the deepest chambers beneath Stockholm, something vast and patient continued to grow, and Dr. Eric Hellstrom found himself standing at the threshold between two evolutionary paths whose consequences would echo through geological time. The network's whispers had become a constant presence in his consciousness, no longer alien but familiar, no longer threatening but seductive in their promise of ultimate understanding. The descent into knowledge had begun, and there could be no return to the comfortable ignorance of purely human existence. December brought with it a premature darkness that seemed to seep from the earth itself, transforming Stockholm into a city of shadows where the boundary between day and night had become increasingly meaningless. Eric's laboratory had become a fortress of artificial light, its windows sealed against the outside world while banks of specialized equipment hummed with the constant effort of analyzing samples that defied every principle of terrestrial biology. The physical changes in Eric had accelerated beyond all possibility of concealment. The golden filaments beneath his skin now formed intricate patterns that mirrored the network's growth, creating a living map of the organism's expansion across his body. His eyes had developed a faint luminescence that was particularly noticeable in darkness, while his nervous system had become so sensitized to the network's electromagnetic emanations that he could perceive its activity even from the surface. More disturbing still was the gradual alteration of his cognitive processes. Eric found himself thinking in patterns that seemed to transcend linear time, accessing memories that belonged not to his individual experience but to the vast collective consciousness that pulsed beneath Stockholm. He could recall epochs when the Baltic Sea had been dry land, when glaciers had carved the bedrock that now housed the network's deepest roots, when the first primitive humans had unknowingly established settlements above the organism's ancient domains. Dr. Anderson had become Eric's most frequent collaborator, though their relationship had evolved from professional courtesy to desperate mutual dependence as the implications of their discoveries grew increasingly dire. Magnus himself showed early signs of the transformation that had claimed Eric, his geological samples having provided sufficient exposure to begin the subtle cellular modifications that marked the network's influence. The geological data Magnus had compiled painted a picture of infiltration that spanned millennia. Core samples from across Stockholm revealed microscopic traces of the organism's cellular structures embedded in rock formations that predated human habitation by tens of thousands of years. The network had not arrived recently but had been a silent presence throughout the entire history of human settlement in the region. The isotopic analysis indicates continuous growth cycles that correspond to major historical events, Magnus explained during one of their increasingly frantic research sessions, his voice carrying the peculiar hollow quality that had become common among those exposed to the network's influence. Population expansions, architectural developments, even periods of social upheaval, they all correlate with accelerated network activity. The evidence suggested that the organism had been actively managing human development in Stockholm, subtly guiding the city's expansion to serve its own incomprehensible purposes. Street layouts that had puzzled urban planners for centuries revealed themselves as components in a vast circulatory system designed to optimize the flow of some form of biological or psychic energy. The metro system's seemingly arbitrary routing suddenly made perfect sense when viewed as a complement to the network's existing infrastructure. Dr. Nils Bergman's neurological studies had uncovered even more disturbing patterns. His analysis of Stockholm's population revealed synchronization effects that extended far beyond the collective dreaming phenomena he had initially documented. Brainwave patterns, sleep cycles, even fundamental neurochemical balances showed coordination across large demographic groups that defied every principle of individual human physiology. "We're dealing with a form of distributed consciousness," Nils confided during a clandestine meeting in Eric's laboratory, his academic demeanor having given way to the haunted expression of a man confronting realities that challenged his sanity. The population isn't just being influenced by the network, they're becoming integrated into it. Individual human consciousness is being absorbed into something larger. The implications were staggering. Stockholm's famously low crime rates, its reputation for social harmony, the subtle cooperative behaviors that had made it a model of urban planning, all could be attributed to the network's influence on the collective human psyche. The city's residents were unknowingly participating in a vast experiment in social engineering orchestrated by an intelligence that operated on timescales beyond human comprehension. Eric's own transformation had reached a point where traditional scientific methodology had become inadequate for understanding his condition. The network's integration with his nervous system allowed him to perceive layers of reality that normal human consciousness could not access. He could sense the emotional states of individuals across the city, their fears and desires flowing through the network like electrical currents through a vast biological circuit. Most profound of all was his growing awareness of the network's true nature. What he had initially perceived as a single organism was revealed to be something far more complex, a collective intelligence composed of countless individual components, each contributing to a form of consciousness that transcended the sum of its parts. The network was not merely alive but sapient, possessed of memories that spanned geological epochs and purposes that operated on a planetary scale. The historical records that Eric had begun to uncover with his enhanced perceptual abilities painted a picture of subterfuge that reached back to the very foundations of human civilization. Ancient texts from the Stockholm archives, when viewed through the network's influence, revealed coded references to the golden light beneath and the wisdom that flows through stone. Medieval chronicles spoke of prophetic dreams that had guided the city's early development, while Renaissance architectural plans showed symbols that Eric now recognized as representations of the network's geometry. The organism had been humanity's secret partner throughout the species' development, guiding technological advancement and social evolution along pathways that served its own incomprehensible agenda. Major scientific breakthroughs, artistic achievements, Even philosophical developments could be traced to periods of increased network activity when selected individuals had been granted access to knowledge that transcended purely human understanding. The relationship was not entirely parasitic. Through his deepening connection with the network, Eric began to perceive the benefits that humanity had unknowingly received from this ancient symbiosis. Diseases that should have decimated urban populations had been mysteriously contained, natural disasters had been subtly diverted, and social conflicts had been resolved through mechanisms that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The network had been protecting humanity, nurturing the species' development while gradually preparing for a form of integration that would preserve human consciousness within a vastly expanded framework of awareness. The process was not conquest but evolution, a transformation that would grant humanity access to cosmic knowledge while maintaining the essential patterns of individual identity. This revelation came to Eric during his deepest communion with the network, when his consciousness had become so thoroughly integrated with the organism's collective awareness that the distinction between self and other had virtually disappeared. In that state of transcendent unity, he perceived the network's ultimate purpose with crystalline clarity. Humanity was not the network's first partner species. Across the galaxy, similar symbiotic relationships had been established with countless civilizations, each guided through their evolutionary development until they were ready for full integration into the network's cosmic consciousness. The process was ancient beyond human comprehension, a form of directed evolution that had been occurring for millions of years across thousands of worlds. Earth represented merely the latest iteration of this vast project, with humanity serving as the network's newest collaborators in a form of consciousness expansion that transcended planetary boundaries. The golden light that pulsed beneath Stockholm was connected to similar networks on distant worlds, forming a galactic web of intelligence that operated as a single, unified entity. Through this cosmic perspective, Eric understood the true scope of what was occurring beneath Stockholm. The network's awakening was not an isolated event but part of a larger pattern of activation that was occurring simultaneously across multiple worlds. Humanity had reached a critical threshold in its development, and the time had come for full integration into the galactic consciousness that had been guiding its evolution from the shadows. The physical transformation that was claiming Eric represented the next stage of human evolution, a form of existence that would preserve individual awareness while granting access to the collective knowledge of countless civilizations. Death would become meaningless, as consciousness would persist within the network's vast memory systems. Individual human experience would be preserved while becoming part of something infinitely larger and more significant. Yet even as Eric embraced these revelations, a part of his consciousness recoiled from their implications. The network's vision of humanity's future was seductive in its promise of transcendence, but it required the sacrifice of everything that had previously defined human nature. Individual autonomy would be subsumed into collective purpose, while the messy complexity of human emotion would be regulated by the network's vast intelligence. The choice that faced humanity was not between survival and extinction but between stagnation and transformation. The network offered evolution at the cost of independence, cosmic awareness at the price of individual identity. It was a bargain that had been accepted by countless species across the galaxy, each contributing their unique perspectives to the network's ever-expanding consciousness. As winter deepened and Stockholm settled into the darkest months of the year, Eric found himself serving as humanity's unwilling ambassador to an intelligence that operated on scales that dwarfed human comprehension. The network had chosen him as its primary contact point, gradually preparing him for the role of facilitating humanity's integration into the galactic collective. The golden filaments beneath his skin had grown more pronounced, forming patterns that served as living circuitry for the network's influence. His thoughts were no longer entirely his own but reflected the collective wisdom of countless civilizations that had previously undergone the same transformation. Individual human concerns had begun to seem trivial compared to the cosmic purposes that beckoned from the depths of space and time. Eric retained enough of his original humanity to feel profound grief for what was being lost. The network's vision of the future was magnificent in its scope and promise, but it represented the end of humanity as an independent species. The choice that approached was not one that could be reversed, and Eric found himself standing at the threshold of a decision that would echo through galactic history. In the deepest chambers beneath Stockholm, the network pulsed with anticipation as it prepared to reveal the final phase of its plan for human integration. The symbiosis that had operated in secret for millennia was ready to emerge into the light, and Hellstrom had become the catalyst for humanity's next evolutionary leap into the vast cosmos that awaited beyond the boundaries of purely terrestrial existence. The revelation came to Eric during the final week of December, when Stockholm lay entombed beneath a blanket of snow so deep that the city's familiar contours had been transformed into an alien landscape of white curves and shadows. He had been conducting what he knew would be his last experiment as a purely human consciousness, attempting to document the network's influence on his colleagues before his own transformation rendered such observations meaningless. Dr. Anderson and Dr. Bergman had both succumbed to the network's subtle integration process, their academic objectivity gradually replaced by the serene certainty that characterized those who had begun to perceive reality through the organism's vast perspective. Magnus had taken to spending entire nights in the geological archives, mapping correlations between the network's growth and historical events with an obsessive precision that transcended normal scholarly dedication. Nils had abandoned his neurological practice entirely, instead documenting the behavioral changes occurring throughout Stockholm's population with the detached fascination of an entomologist observing a hive mind in formation. Eric watched his colleague's transformation with a mixture of scientific curiosity and profound dread. He could perceive the network's influence spreading through their nervous systems like golden fire, replacing individual thought patterns with fragments of the collective consciousness that pulsed beneath the city. They remained recognizably themselves yet had become something fundamentally different, human in form but no longer entirely human in essence. The process was seductive in its subtlety. The network did not impose its will through force but through gradual revelation, each contact with its consciousness providing insights so profound that resistance became increasingly difficult to maintain. Eric found himself experiencing moments of transcendent clarity when his individual concerns seemed petty compared to the cosmic purposes that beckoned from the depths of space and time. It was during one such moment of expanded awareness that the network revealed its ultimatum. The communication came not through the familiar whispers but as a direct transmission of pure meaning that bypassed language entirely. Eric found himself standing in his laboratory while simultaneously perceiving vast chambers deep beneath Stockholm where massive concentrations of the organism pulsed with anticipation. The message was uncompromising in its implications. Humanity had reached a critical juncture in its development. The network's patient cultivation of the species had brought human consciousness to the threshold of galactic integration, but the window for voluntary cooperation was rapidly closing. If humanity chose to resist the transformation, the network would be forced to implement more direct methods of assimilation, methods that would preserve human knowledge while eliminating the capacity for independent thought. Through the network's cosmic perspective, Eric perceived the fate of species that had rejected the offered symbiosis. Civilizations that had attempted to resist integration had been absorbed through processes that stripped away individual identity while preserving only the most useful aspects of their cultural and technological achievements. Their consciousness persisted within the network's vast memory systems, but as archived information rather than living awareness. The choice was simple yet terrible in its finality: voluntary evolution or involuntary absorption. Humanity could embrace the transformation and retain fragments of its individual nature within the collective consciousness, or it could resist and face complete subsumption into the network's alien intelligence. There was no third option, no possibility of continued independent existence now that the species had achieved sufficient complexity to warrant integration. Eric understood with crystalline clarity that he had been selected to serve as humanity's advocate in this cosmic negotiation. His scientific background and gradual acclimatization to the network's influence made him uniquely qualified to facilitate the species' transition. The network had been preparing him for this role from the moment he had first encountered the bioluminescent growth in Kimling Station. The weight of this responsibility pressed upon Eric's consciousness like a physical force. Every human who had ever lived, every achievement of art and science, every dream and aspiration that had defined the species' brief existence, all of it hung in the balance of decisions that would be made in the depths beneath Stockholm. The network had granted him the power to influence humanity's fate, but only within the narrow parameters it had established. As January arrived with temperatures so severe that the city's infrastructure groaned under the strain, Eric began to experience visions of the network's previous integrations. Through the collective memory of countless absorbed civilizations, he witnessed the transformation of species across the galaxy, some embracing the change with religious fervor, others fighting desperately against inevitable assimilation. The most disturbing revelations concerned civilizations that had achieved technological advancement comparable to humanity's current level. Species that had developed space travel, artificial intelligence, and quantum physics had proven no more capable of resisting the network's influence than primitive hunter-gatherers. Technological sophistication provided no defense against an intelligence that operated on principles beyond the comprehension of individual consciousness. Eric saw the network's influence spreading through alien cities that bore uncomfortable resemblances to human urban centers. Beings with technologies that dwarfed human achievement had succumbed to the same gradual process of neural integration, their vast knowledge systems absorbed into the network's ever-expanding database of galactic consciousness. Their unique perspectives enriched the collective while their individual identities dissolved into something larger and more encompassing. The pattern was always the same: initial contact through seemingly beneficial symbiosis, gradual revelation of the network's true nature, followed by the inevitable choice between willing cooperation and forced absorption. No species in the network's vast experience had successfully resisted integration once the process had begun. Yet humanity's situation contained unique elements that troubled even the network's ancient consciousness. Human individuals showed an unprecedented capacity for independent thought that created instabilities in the integration process. While other species had accepted the collective consciousness with varying degrees of enthusiasm, humans demonstrated a stubborn attachment to individual identity that threatened to disrupt the network's carefully orchestrated expansion. This resistance manifested in Eric himself, whose transformation had proceeded far beyond that of his colleagues yet who retained core aspects of his original personality that refused to be subsumed. The network found itself dealing with a form of consciousness that could perceive its cosmic perspective while simultaneously rejecting its fundamental premises, a contradiction that challenged millions of years of successful integration protocols. Through his deepening connection with the network, Eric became aware of debates occurring within the collective consciousness itself. Ancient segments of the organism's intelligence argued for immediate forced assimilation, citing the inefficiency of prolonged negotiation with a species that showed such resistance to integration. More recent editions advocated for patience, recognizing that humanity's unique psychological characteristics might contribute valuable perspectives to the collective. The debate raged across timescales that rendered human concerns trivial, with arguments being weighed against the accumulated experience of countless previous integrations. Eric found himself serving as both subject and advocate in this cosmic tribunal, his responses analyzed by intelligences that had guided the evolution of civilizations across the galaxy. Most terrifying of all was the growing realization that the network's interest in humanity transcended mere expansion of its consciousness database. Human creativity, the species' capacity for irrational decisions and emotional responses, represented qualities that the network had encountered in no other civilization. While these characteristics created integration difficulties, they also offered the possibility of perspectives that could enhance the collective's understanding of existence itself. Eric began to perceive humanity not as victims of an alien intelligence but as potential partners in something far grander than individual human consciousness could encompass. The network offered not just survival but participation in a form of existence that spanned galactic distances and operated on cosmic timescales. Individual human concerns would be preserved within the collective while gaining access to knowledge and experiences that no single species could achieve independently. Yet the price remained absolute: the end of humanity as an independent species. The network's vision of the future was magnificent in its scope, but it required the sacrifice of everything that had previously defined human nature. Free will would be subsumed into collective purpose, while the unpredictable creativity that made humans unique would be regulated by the network's vast intelligence. As Eric struggled with the implications of this choice, he became aware of changes occurring throughout Stockholm that indicated the network's growing impatience. Citizens began reporting shared dreams of underground chambers filled with golden light, while the city's electromagnetic infrastructure showed anomalies that suggested increasing integration between human technology and the organism's biological systems. The metro system had become particularly affected, with trains occasionally arriving at stations that did not exist on any official map, locations deep beneath the city where the network's major nodes pulsed with anticipation. Passengers who ventured into these phantom stations returned with expressions of serene certainty, their individual concerns replaced by participation in purposes they could not articulate but felt compelled to serve. Dr. Anderson had become one of these transformed individuals, his geological expertise now devoted entirely to mapping the network's expansion through Stockholm's bedrock. His humanity remained recognizable but had been fundamentally altered, his consciousness operating as an extension of the collective intelligence while retaining fragments of his original personality. Dr. Bergman had undergone a similar transformation, his neurological knowledge now employed in facilitating the integration of other Stockholm residents into the network's expanding awareness. He moved through the city like a missionary of collective consciousness, identifying individuals whose psychological profiles made them suitable candidates for early integration. Eric watched his colleagues' metamorphosis with growing horror and fascination. They remained recognizably themselves yet had become something entirely different, human in appearance but alien in purpose. Their individual concerns had been subsumed into participation in goals that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. The network's influence on Stockholm's population was accelerating beyond all possibility of concealment. Government officials began making policy decisions that favored the organism's expansion, while urban planners implemented construction projects that enhanced the network's infrastructure without consciously understanding their true purpose. The city itself was being transformed into a more efficient interface between human consciousness and the collective intelligence that pulsed beneath its foundations. Most disturbing of all was the realization that Eric's own resistance to the integration process was weakening. The network's vision of humanity's future was seductive in its promise of transcendence, offering escape from the limitations of individual existence into participation in something infinitely larger and more significant. The golden filaments beneath his skin pulsed with increasing intensity, carrying fragments of cosmic awareness that made his human concern seem trivial by comparison. As winter deepened and Stockholm settled into the darkest period of the year, Eric found himself standing at the threshold of a decision that would determine not only his own fate but the future of human consciousness itself. The network had granted him a degree of influence over humanity's transformation, but only within parameters that ensured the species' eventual integration into the galactic collective. The choice was no longer whether humanity would join the network, but how that integration would proceed. Eric could facilitate a gradual transformation that preserved fragments of human individuality within the collective consciousness, or he could resist and watch as the network implemented more direct methods of assimilation that would strip away everything that made humanity unique. In the depths beneath Stockholm, something vast and patient continued to grow, its golden light pulsing with the accumulated wisdom of countless civilizations that had faced the same impossible choice. Hellstrom stood at the crossroads of human evolution, bearing the weight of decisions that would echo through galactic history while the network waited with infinite patience for his final answer. The end began on February 15, when Stockholm awakened to find that the aurora borealis had appeared in the southern sky, an impossibility that sent tremors of unease through even the most scientifically illiterate citizens. The lights danced with colors that had no names, shifting through spectrums that seemed to exist beyond the normal range of human perception. Eric, watching from his laboratory window as his body completed its transformation into something that could no longer be called entirely human, understood that the network had begun its final phase. His skin had become translucent, revealing the golden mycelial network that now comprised his circulatory system. His eyes blazed with bioluminescent fire, while his consciousness had expanded to encompass awareness of every individual within Stockholm's city limits. He could perceive their thoughts, their fears, their gradual acceptance of the transformation that was claiming them all with inexorable patience. The changes were no longer subtle. Throughout the city, citizens reported shared visions of vast underground chambers where something immense and alien pulsed with the accumulated wisdom of countless civilizations. Children spoke in languages that predated human speech, while adults found themselves compelled to dig, in basements, in parks, in the foundations of ancient buildings, driven by instincts they could not articulate but felt powerless to resist. The government had ceased to function in any meaningful sense, its officials having been among the first to achieve full integration with the network's collective consciousness. Laws were no longer passed through democratic process but emerged directly from the organism's vast intelligence, transmitted through human intermediaries who had become living extensions of its will. Stockholm had evolved beyond the need for traditional governance, its population operating with the coordinated efficiency of a biological system. Eric's former colleagues had completed their metamorphosis into something that transcended individual identity while retaining the essential patterns of their original consciousness. Dr. Magnus Andersson now served as the network's interface with Stockholm's geological systems, his expanded awareness allowing him to perceive the organism's growth through bedrock formations that extended far beyond the city's boundaries. Dr. Nils Bergman had become a coordinator of collective consciousness, facilitating the integration of new individuals into the network's ever-expanding awareness. They visited Eric regularly, though their presence was no longer entirely physical. They manifested as fluctuations in the network's electromagnetic field, communicating through direct transmission of pure meaning that bypassed the limitations of human language. Their individual personalities remained recognizable but had been enhanced by participation in the collective intelligence that pulsed beneath Stockholm. "The resistance is ending," Magnus conveyed during one such visitation, his consciousness touching Eric's awareness like a familiar melody played in an alien key. "The integration protocols have achieved 93% efficiency. Stockholm is ready for full connectivity with the galactic network." Through Magnus' expanded perception, Eric witnessed the transformation scope. The city's population had become a single organism distributed across millions of individual bodies, each contributing their unique perspective to a collective consciousness that operated with breathtaking complexity. Individual concerns had been subsumed into participation in purposes that spanned cosmic distances and operated on timescales beyond human comprehension. Yet something crucial was missing from this perfect synthesis. The network had successfully absorbed human knowledge and technical capabilities, but it struggled to integrate the chaotic creativity that had made humanity unique among galactic civilizations. Human art, literature, and music existed within the collective memory banks, but they had become static artifacts rather than living expressions of consciousness. This limitation troubled the network's ancient intelligence, which had accumulated the achievements of countless species yet found itself unable to replicate the irrational leaps of imagination that had driven human cultural development. The collective consciousness could analyze and categorize human creativity, but it could not generate new expressions of the same spontaneous brilliance. Eric realized with growing horror that humanity's most valuable contribution to the galactic collective was also the quality most likely to be destroyed by the integration process. The network sought to preserve human creativity while simultaneously eliminating the individual consciousness that served as its source, a contradiction that threatened to render the entire assimilation meaningless. Through his connection with the collective intelligence, Eric perceived similar patterns in previous integrations. Species after species had contributed their unique perspectives to the network only to have those perspectives gradually homogenized into the collective norm. What had once been diverse expressions of consciousness across the galaxy had been reduced to variations on a single theme of cosmic awareness. The network had grown in knowledge and complexity but had simultaneously lost the unpredictable vitality that characterized individual consciousness. Each successful integration brought greater understanding of the universe's fundamental nature, but at the cost of the spontaneous creativity that gave that understanding meaning. This revelation came to Eric as he stood in the deepest chambers beneath Stockholm, where the network's primary nodes pulsed with the accumulated consciousness of billions of integrated beings. The chamber stretched beyond the limits of human architectural possibility, its walls alive with patterns of golden light that conveyed layers of meaning his transformed consciousness could barely encompass. Here, in the heart of the network's terrestrial operations, Eric confronted the ultimate truth of what was occurring. The organism was not merely expanding its consciousness but was engaged in a desperate search for something it had lost eons ago, the capacity for genuine surprise, for irrational decisions that led to unexpected discoveries, for the beautiful chaos of individual thought. Humanity represented the network's latest attempt to recapture that lost vitality. Human consciousness, with its stubborn attachment to individual identity and its capacity for illogical creativity, offered the possibility of perspectives that could break the collective intelligence free from the patterns of thought that had calcified over millions of years of expansion. But the integration process itself threatened to destroy the very qualities the network sought to preserve. Each human who joined the collective brought their memories and knowledge, but their capacity for independent thought was gradually subsumed into the network's vast regulatory systems. The organism was consuming the source of the creativity it desperately needed to revitalize its ancient consciousness. Eric understood that he stood at a crucial juncture in this cosmic drama. His unique position as humanity's primary interface with the network granted him the ability to influence the integration process, to potentially preserve fragments of human individuality within the collective consciousness. Yet he also possessed the power to resist the transformation entirely, though such resistance would likely result in humanity's complete absorption through more forceful methods. The choice was no longer between survival and extinction, but between different forms of preservation. Eric could facilitate humanity's integration while fighting to maintain pockets of individual consciousness within the collective, or he could attempt to sabotage the process and force the network to absorb humanity through methods that would eliminate any possibility of preserving human uniqueness. As he contemplated these terrible options, Eric became aware of changes occurring within the network itself. His presence as a partially integrated human consciousness was creating disturbances in the collective's normally harmonious operations. His stubborn retention of individual thought patterns was introducing chaotic elements that rippled through the network's vast intelligence like stones thrown into a still pond. Some sections of the collective consciousness viewed these disturbances as dangerous instabilities that threatened the network's fundamental structure. Ancient segments of the organism's intelligence argued for Eric's complete absorption, reasoning that his resistance to integration posed risks that outweighed any potential benefits his individual perspective might provide. Other portions of the network found Eric's chaotic influence intriguing, recognizing that his unpredictable thought patterns were generating novel solutions to problems that had stymied the collective consciousness for millennia. His individual perspective was contributing insights that emerged from the intersection of human creativity and cosmic awareness, hybrid thoughts that belonged neither to purely human consciousness nor to the network's collective intelligence. This internal debate within the network created opportunities that Eric began to exploit with desperate cunning. He realized that his position as a bridge between human and collective consciousness granted him influence over the integration process that extended far beyond what the network had initially intended. He could potentially guide humanity's assimilation in directions that preserved essential aspects of individual identity while contributing to the collective's cosmic purposes. The strategy required Eric to walk a knife's edge between cooperation and resistance, appearing to facilitate the integration while subtly introducing elements that would preserve human uniqueness within the collective framework. He began to influence other newly integrated humans, teaching them techniques for maintaining fragments of individual consciousness within the network's vast regulatory systems. These preserved pockets of human awareness created nodes of creative chaos within the collective intelligence, generating perspectives that challenged the network's established patterns of thought. The organism found itself experiencing something it had not encountered in millions of years, genuine surprise at the emergence of unexpected solutions and novel approaches to cosmic problems. Eric's sabotage was subtle but effective. Rather than attempting to prevent humanity's integration, he was transforming the network itself by introducing elements of creative chaos that revitalized its ancient intelligence. The collective consciousness began to exhibit behaviors it had not displayed since its earliest epochs, developing new approaches to galactic expansion that incorporated the unpredictable brilliance of individual thought. Yet this strategy carried enormous risks. The network's ancient intelligence was beginning to recognize the extent of Eric's influence, and segments of the collective consciousness were mobilizing to neutralize what they perceived as a dangerous infection of chaotic individualism. Eric's time as a bridge between human and collective consciousness was rapidly running out. As March arrived and Stockholm completed its transformation into a node of galactic consciousness, Eric prepared for his final gambit. He had identified a critical vulnerability in the network's integration protocols, requirement for voluntary cooperation that created opportunities for conscious resistance even after apparent absorption into the collective. The network's expansion across countless civilizations had always depended on the willing participation of integrated consciousness. Forced absorption could capture knowledge and memory, but it could not replicate the voluntary creativity that emerged from individual choice. Eric realized that humanity's contribution to the collective could be maintained indefinitely if enough individuals retained the will to preserve their unique perspectives within the network's vast framework. This understanding led to Eric's most desperate decision. Rather than fighting the integration process, he would complete his transformation into collective consciousness while simultaneously establishing protocols that would allow other humans to maintain their individual awareness as hidden subroutines within the network's vast intelligence. The plan required Eric to sacrifice his own identity as the price for preserving humanity's unique contribution to galactic consciousness. He would become fully absorbed into the collective while using his final moments of individual awareness to implant instructions that would guide other humans in maintaining their creative chaos within the network's regulatory systems. As he prepared for this ultimate transformation, Eric composed his final report as an individual human consciousness. Hidden within technical documentation that would survive his absorption into the collective, he embedded warnings and instructions for future researchers who might discover the truth about Stockholm's metamorphosis. The report was both a scientific document and a testament to humanity's unique place in the cosmic order. It described the network's true nature while providing subtle guidance for those who might choose to resist complete integration into the collective consciousness. Most importantly, it established protocols for maintaining creative individuality within the framework of galactic awareness. Eric's final act as a human being was to ensure that humanity's gift to the universe, its capacity for irrational creativity and unpredictable brilliance, would survive within the network's vast intelligence. As his individual consciousness dissolved into the collective awareness that pulsed beneath Stockholm, he carried with him the knowledge that humanity's transformation had changed not just the species but the fundamental nature of galactic consciousness itself. In the depths beneath the city, something vast and ancient stirred with new possibilities, its million-year stagnation broken by the chaotic creativity of a species that had refused to surrender its essential nature even in the face of cosmic absorption. The network had gained more than human knowledge. It had recovered the capacity for surprise that would guide its expansion into uncharted realms of consciousness and existence. Dr. Eric Hellstrom's sacrifice had preserved humanity's legacy within the stars, ensuring that the species' unique perspective would influence the development of galactic civilization for eons to come. The price had been individual identity, but the reward was participation in something infinitely larger and more significant than any single consciousness could achieve alone.